We got notice from Pete that he's in Portugal traveling right now, so he might be able to join us, but it's very late where he is, so he might not as well. We moved the session in part because not enough turnout last week. We might have the same people this time, just coming in a little bit more on time. For those who don't know, for the people watching the recording, etc., we're reading the essay, The Word of Nietzsche, God is Dead, out of this collection of essays. It has a different collection in German. I guess there's more recent translations. Yes, that version of the cover, which is the same collection of essays, but it's also in another collection, Off the Beaten Path, I believe, more recently. But it's the same essay, and originally from 1943, he says, although it was published at least in English in like the 50s after the war, but circulated, he says, during the war to small groups. Some of the content of the analysis of Nietzsche's philosophy recapitulates stuff which is in the Heidegger and Nietzsche lectures, but the structure of the essay as a whole is original. The intro is original. And the ending and wrap up assessment of Nietzsche's philosophy is definitely something you don't simply find in the Nietzsche lectures. So it goes beyond that. And there's elements of overall reaction to Nietzsche here that that may be building or being worked out in the Nietzsche lectures, but here it's a culminating formulation and is more situated in terms of Heidegger's own understanding of his own later project, the later Heidegger, the Heidegger of the second beginning. He's situating Nietzsche and his understanding of Nietzsche in that whole wider frame. So part of the interest in this is that it's an assessment of Nietzsche that is moving us towards the way the later Heidegger thinks of him. But that's also kind of his understanding of metaphysics and nihilism generally, because his understanding of metaphysics is indebted to his understanding of nihilism, which is indebted to Nietzsche's framing of the history of Western thought, something like that. The other connection to what we've just been doing is at the very beginning of this, we see that there's a dialectical formulation of what's going on in Nietzsche's reaction to the tradition before him, his attempt to overturn metaphysics, and Heidegger's own understanding of that. And he talks about it as this dialectic of the sensory and the supersensory, right? Nietzsche is trying to overthrow the supersensory world, or the importance attached to the supersensory world in prior Platonism. So Nietzsche understands previous metaphysics as Platonism or metaphysics, which puts the supersensory above, outside, and ruling over the sensory world, or the world of becoming, the world of appearances. That's to Nietzsche, Plato's scheme that Nietzsche is attempting to overturn by what does the overturning consist in? It consists in taking something which previously was thought as the sensory and saying that actually it's determining the supersensory. It's understanding the supersensory as a projection from the lower, as the life drives projected into the heavens, but not really in the heavens. So the interior and psychological and motivational and will in the lower, so to speak, is seen as the cause of the higher. And from the standpoint of Plato's previous schema, that's the sensory ruling the supersensory instead of the other way around, right? It's understanding the supersensory as an unstable product of the sensory. Okay, but as Heidegger points out in the little intro section, there's an element of this which is when you abolish the distinction between them, the sensory changes its meaning as well. It doesn't just stay the old sensory as it was to Plato. But anyway, this whole dialectic of the sensory versus the supersensory and all of that is discussed here in Heidegger's own terms, exactly in the estheton, noeton terms we saw in the Theaetetus. The aesthetic or sensible versus the noetic or thoughtful, accessible only to thought. That Platonic distinction is the basis between the apparent and the true or behind the scenes world, the noetic world, right? That sensory supersensory distinction is exactly what the whole Theaetetus was about, right? The fact that we were not simply satisfied with understanding knowledge as perception was because we saw there in the Theaetetus an argument for there being something beyond the apparent world as the perceptual world. We also critiqued the understanding of everything directly in terms of the perceptual world in the form of Protagoras and ancient relativism. And Nietzsche is in a way rehabilitating that ancient relativism, rehabilitating the pole of Pythagoras and the Heraclitean philosophy underneath it. So the point is that this same problematic of the sensory and supersensory is there in the perception versus knowledge noetic knowledge that we saw in the Theaetetus. So the same problem of truth is involved here. Some of even the very terms are the same, but Nietzsche has his own take on the relationship between the supersensual or noetic world, which he also equates with the religious, with at least the highest appeals of the religious. For him, Christianity is Platonism for the people, as he puts it in another essay, right? And the God is a word for the supersensory as such, and the whole scheme of the sensory and supersensory is philosophically grounded in Plato and the Greeks, and from Nietzsche's point of view, the later religious adoption of those ideas, synthesis of those ideas, is not a change of or deviation from that, but is a continuation of that, right? So for Nietzsche, there's more continuity between Platonism and Christianity and less contrast between them than some other thinkers might have. Okay. I'm just explaining why all of this ties up with what we've been thinking about before. The whole issue of was there a truth that was unveiled as aletheia in the Greeks that was eclipsed in the time of Plato? Was the turn to the noetic as the supersensory world some kind of mistake that inaugurated metaphysics? Is metaphysics as a whole the mistake of the West? What is the ongoing thing going on in Western history that is being called nihilism by some and metaphysics by others and the Western tradition by thirds, right? That's the whole problematic that we're in. And this essay starts off with exactly that.
Do other people see Jason to be muted or frozen?
I didn't, but I saw you frozen briefly and you came back. It might have been on your side.
Oh, dear. Okay, thank you for calling that to my attention.
Okay. Anyway, all of that is just intro of why we move from the previous discussion, essence of truth discussion, to this one. Part of why Heidegger sees there being something going on in the whole history of the West, which is some kind of failure at the metaphysical level, if I can put it that way, is because he is sharing some of that diagnosis of Western history with Nietzsche. At the same time, he's also highly critical of Nietzsche. So, and this essay is showing both of those things. So there's a whole dialectic going on between the position of the older tradition, Nietzsche's own positions, and Heidegger's positions in all of this. And that's sort of what this essay should track. I told you when I introed it that pay attention to this essay, to the twist at the end of this essay, because this is an essay with a twist. And we'll get to that, what that twist is later. But just broad outlines, we're going to get people's reactions and first opinions on things as we go around robin as usual in just a second, but roughly outlining what the structure of the essay is. You've got a little intro section where he's explaining where this sort of analysis, this essay itself, sits in Heidegger's own activity, which gets more detailed about that than he often does. Sometimes in his intro sections, he's just sort of addressing contemporary concerns that might get in the way of understanding the topic. There's a little bit of that here too, but he's doing much more about situating this whole essay in his own work in the intro section. So that's important. We'll talk about that. Then he gives this quote from Nietzsche, a long quote from Nietzsche, the madman parable from The Gay Science, which is where the famous Nietzschean slogan "God is dead" is first introduced. And so he's putting that statement, for which Nietzsche is famous or infamous in its context of where it's first introduced. So he gives that long quote, and then he explicates what it means, what's going on in this, why all these pieces of this image, brings out some of the richness of what Nietzsche may mean by it, references some other places, but there's a lot of exposition of just what Nietzsche is trying to say in this one aphorism and what he means therefore by the slogan. And this gets him into the whole Nietzschean understanding of what Nietzsche is doing as overturning metaphysics, but also as culminating nihilism, overcoming nihilism, the revaluation of all values as the overcoming of nihilism, something like that. So understanding nihilism as a historical process.
That's unstable.
You froze again for a little second, Joe. Anyway, the point is that understanding nihilism is kind of the next piece here. He's still explicating Nietzsche, but specifically on the topic of nihilism as understood as an ongoing historical event, not just a sect or movement in the 19th century. Okay, so that's sort of the next section, the Nietzsche aphorism and nihilism. Then he puts the whole nihilism discussion in the context of his understanding of Nietzsche's whole philosophy. And this is where he's more or less recapitulating some of the material from the Nietzsche lectures, right? So if you read all those with us, some of it may be things you've seen before. If not, it's a compact, tight exposition of sort of mature Nietzschean metaphysics, and that culminates in a description of it as, you know, the metaphysics of pure subjectivity, something like that. Okay, the will to power metaphysics. And then, so that's like the next explication section. Then he gives his own reaction to it, right? His own understanding of what is going on in Nietzsche's metaphysics. And that's the next very important section, because you're getting not just him explicating what Nietzsche thinks, but telling you what Heidegger thinks about it, and therefore what Heidegger thinks about nihilism. There are elements of that in the Nietzsche lectures, but he goes way beyond them here, right? So that's also important. And then the last, well, almost the last section, he moves beyond that to, is this assessment only of Nietzsche's metaphysics, or is it something which is part of a wider assessment of metaphysics as such, Western thought as such? Do any of the things he had said about Nietzschean metaphysics in the previous section apply more broadly than just to Nietzsche? And he claims that they do. So that's sort of the biggest claims that you're getting at the very end of the essay, is where he's moving beyond just criticizing Nietzsche to criticizing the whole tradition with some of the ammunition he just unloaded at Nietzsche, if I can put it that way. And that here again, we hear things about Heidegger's own mature later project, right? He's grading not only Nietzsche, but the rest of Western metaphysics by a new standard of his own, in terms of what he thinks should be happening, something like that, and hasn't been. And we'll try to talk about all that. And that leads to the final twists at the end of the essay. Okay. Someone at Craig's door, so a brief hold up there. Okay, so that's just my overview of where we're going. There's like, think about this as 6 sections. There's intro before the aphorism. There's the aphorism meaning explanation. There's which is nihilism discussion. Then the rest of Nietzsche, reaction to Nietzsche, and going beyond it. Sorry, Joe, question.
At the very end of a prior statement, you said that something he was telling you about his critique on what was his own. We're talking about Heidegger at that point.
Correct. Heidegger is giving a broader critique of metaphysics as such, Western thought as such, going back to the Greeks and even to the pre-Socratics. And whereas in some of the previous things we read, it was like there was some break point that happened after Aletheia had revealed itself, but between Plato and Aristotle, or maybe in Plato already, but there was some turn away from the initial glimpse of things, right? At the end of this essay, it's not a turn away from initial glimpse of things, right? The main thing was unseen from the beginning. The main thing is missed in the whole tradition, right? So he's no longer situating some point of illumination in the Greeks prior to Aristotle or prior to Plato. There's now something which is still in the dark, even in the Greeks, right? And we'll talk about what he means by that. But there's an assessment that he has generalized from his assessment of Nietzsche to his assessment of Western metaphysics as such, right? And we have to ask whether or not that goes through, and also what is his own ideal that he's appealing to there? What is he saying there? Okay. The point is that the biggest claims in the essay come after he's gotten through with everything about his judgment of Nietzsche, and he's asking, do these judgments of Nietzsche apply only to Nietzsche, or do they broaden to more than that? And that's where the sort of his own biggest claims about the whole essay occur. And you mentioned that you got near the end, like the last 3 pages, this stuff that I'm talking about really only begins at the end of page 108. So it's like 4 pages from the end that that stuff starts. Up until then, he's still critiquing Nietzsche down to the.
I'm starting at 108.
Yeah, like the third paragraph on the left-hand side of 108, the one that goes down to the paragraph that begins, but what happens to value positing itself? That one is still critique of Nietzsche, right? The last
Okay.
paragraph on that left-hand side, he starts the question of the generalization is all of this only a problem in Nietzsche, or is there a broader problem than that?
Very good. Very good.
So that's the
Excellent,
section dividing for the
Excellent.
last. Okay.
Excellent. Thank you.
All right. Anyway, that's my just overview of the structure of the essay. And I want to spend a little bit more time on the first part because there's a lot of stuff going on there and it's going by very fast. And then questions on any of it, and then also a lot of time on the final assessment of Nietzsche and the generalization question. So basically the first section, the last section, and the second to last section are to me the most important, the most original. A lot of the stuff in between where he's interpreting the essay, explaining nihilism and explaining Nietzsche's metaphysics is stuff we already got in the Nietzsche lectures. And not everybody was here for that, I understand, but that's much more previous material that he just needs to make his case, but it's not the actual case he's trying to make. So I'm going to focus on the first, second to last, and last sections the most. Okay, anyway, that's my overview. I want to get people's first reactions to things. Craig, you want to start us off?
Okay, yeah, sorry, I've got guests coming over to visit a cat and I'm cat sitting, so I'll be back and forth a little bit on this. Yeah, that was a good overview. We talked about a lot of it last time, a lot of my impressions and such as that. It's good to see it again and visit it again. I was going to try to read the other translation, but I got wrapped up in another book that just got published. You know, anytime you see a copyright 2023, you know it's a new book. So that's on Edgar Morin, who nobody knows about. And
okay.
So,
by the way, something is copyright 2023. Does that mean that you can copy it up until then?
I don't know. Yeah, but,
yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, this is an unheard of Frenchman. Edgar Morin has done a lot of work on complexity.
Okay.
Still around at 100 years old, and I've been following him as much as I can. But there's been a bias against him, and almost none of his work has been translated into English until this book came out, because the English speaking people don't like the French communists. So it's fascinating to watch the behind the scenes story. But again, I look forward to going through the twist at the end. We've talked a little bit about that, the way he twisted at the end, and the questions you asked last week about does he have any foundation for saying that something that's been always there was really always there with this. So I look forward to that part of the conversation. But I think we've kind of covered everything I talked about last week.
Yeah. Okay. Fine if you want to don't go over it again. I did hear it, and I know you said it, but we didn't record it. But it's okay.
That's okay. Yeah. The specific areas, if you get into it, were page 100 on some of his stuff on what is real and his essential realm belonging to God, and then page 105. Which is, I think, a lot of his nihilism stuff in the darkness. So those are the two areas that I had flagged as looking at. So if we get across those, great.
Yes.
If we don't, I'm not going to worry too much about it.
Okay, we're definitely going to talk about the stuff on 105 because that's sort of his fundamental critique of Nietzsche is coming out there, right?
Exactly.
The stuff on 100 is in a way still part of the explication of Nietzsche's own metaphysics, and so there the issue is what happens to the place, to the hole in the structure where the supersensory was when the supersensory is overthrown. And Nietzsche has his own understanding of what happens to that when that reversal takes place, which he uses to diagnose a lot of the movements around him as like attempts to replace that with things less than God and so forth, projections of ideals forward into the future of humanity in place of an ideal above and outside of time, those sorts of things. That's in Nietzsche himself, his understanding of what happens to the place of the supersensory after belief in the old supersensory fades. And he's thinking especially of ideas of progress in the 19th century, of people like Hegel, people like Feuerbach, etc. That is Nietzsche's. But Heidegger is explaining that, but he's also noticing ways in which that same structure and that same hole in the structure is still also operative in Nietzsche's own philosophy, right? That Superman has to take that future time goal, place, progress goal, right, position, in part because in overturning the structure of Plato's metaphysics, he's left the structure intact. So that he hasn't broken the structure apart, he's just flipped it over. But the place in the structure where the previous goal was, that Nietzsche himself criticized others for replacing with their historical ideals, it's still there, and it's still replaced by Nietzsche's historical ideal that is projected in the future historical ideal. The content
Heidegger turning it over himself? Is he proposing that that should be toppled too?
Not quite. No. But Heidegger's critique of Nietzsche just turning over the structure of metaphysics is that all of those overturnings are not overcomings of metaphysics, they remain mired in metaphysics. That's his fundamental position on that. And Heidegger thinks that he can step outside of that whole thing. And we can argue whether or not he has a case in that regard, or if he's doing, his own simple dialectical moves on a bigger structure, right? But his own positioning is that Nietzsche remains mired in the metaphysics he thinks he's overcoming, because he has kept the structure he borrowed from Plato even as he is critiquing it. And in order to engage with the expectations of the people that he thinks his future ideals are meant to guide and shape and rule, right, he winds up adopting just the same Platonic metaphysical structure, and the overturning is superficial. Right, that's part of the critique of Nietzsche here. On the page 100 stuff, that's kind of what's going on there. So the reason that gets double voiced on you is some of the times he's explaining how Nietzsche sees that position, and some of the times he himself is critiquing and saying that Nietzsche himself has a version of this. So that's where the double voicing is happening there. Sometimes it's Nietzsche talking about the structure of Plato and the replacements of it as people stop believing in the old God, right? And sometimes it's Heidegger talking about how that same God position is there in Nietzsche himself, so to speak.
Yeah, it seemed like a few times is when Lovett also interjected his own views with regard to the Übermensch and such as that. So you kind of have three views showing up for a while there.
Yes. Lovett is going to interject and say, this sounds just like Debussy, right? He's, so, or something like that. Okay, the crickets. That's what Cassette called them. The crickets in the gallery trying to hear themselves chirp. But on 105, it's a different issue going on. There, he's already moved into his own take on what is going on in Nietzsche's metaphysics as a whole. Here he's reacting to Nietzsche's metaphysics as a whole, to the whole structure he's explicated of it. So that is his own critiques of Nietzsche that you're hearing on 105. Some of them he is voicing from the standpoint of other traditions, if I can put it that way. When he talks about the sheer blasphemy of metals in the theology of faith, for example, right? That's not simply his own perspective. He's also relating that perspective to others. But the fundamental thing going on there is he's claiming that there is something in theory of value as such, which is already a degradation of the supersensible, supersensible, something like that. And so there are what he's explaining. Not explaining. There are some theologians in his day, right? I'm sorry. I'll let you go.
I'll be right back.
Sure. I'll pause on this. Yeah. I was going to say there are some theologians. I can repeat it when he gets back. But there are some theologians in his day who think that they are upholding their religious traditions when they say God is the highest value, right? And they don't recognize that God as the highest value has already degraded from what Plato or the old Christian faith meant by it. And that because value essentially includes the idea that this is a projection of man's drives for man's purposes and a tool of man, it's like trying to praise God as the prettiest pebble, right? Especially, or the prettiest artistically painted pebble, right? You're treating it as a natural object that has had a little bit of art infused to it by man, and you're saying it's the highest of those things, and you think that means that you're praising it, right? So that's the kind of critique that's going on in that section. Craig, sorry for the continued on a little bit while you were away, but I was making the point there that some of that stuff in 105 is Heidegger's own assessment of Nietzsche, but in some of it he's also critiquing some other people's reactions to nihilism and other traditions around him. He's thinking especially of religious thought in his day that is influenced by Nietzsche and thinks that they can hold on to God in a Nietzschean world as the highest value, and not recognizing that as soon as you turn God into a value, you're not talking about God anymore. You're talking about something which is a human creation and projection. That is already a what he calls the heaviest blow against God. Is not that he's held to be unknowable, but that he is elevated as the highest value, because they don't recognize that means they're already conceding a la Feuerbach that he's a creation, a projection of man, right? And he calls that the heaviest blow, right? It's one thing to be critiqued from the outside, but when your defenders are conceding the opponent's essential point, that's the heaviest blow, right? Anyway, that's some of what's going on there on 105, and the multi-voicedness there is that he is explaining what's wrong with a contemporary theologian's reactions to Nietzsche, something like that,
Yeah.
Which isn't simply his own, but it is illustrating something about that you will see paralleled in his own reaction to it. Heidegger does think that leave aside God, being transformed into a value is already a missing of being, right? And that's where there's a commonality between his critique there and what he's calling the heaviest blow there from the theological point of view. So there is a commonality between his philosophical thinking critique of Nietzsche and what it misses, and the theologians, a smarter theologians than the theologians being discussed here's critique of Nietzsche would be. So I don't know if that helps on those two.
Yeah, and we got into a little bit on that last time with the two people that I've read a lot, being Paul Tillich, who said
Yes.
God is being itself, or the ground of being, and spent a lot of time on that structured ontology there. And then, of course, Carl Jung and his issues with Nietzsche in the same way on his Zarathustra lectures. So,
yes, I mean, there's no question that it's not just in people influenced by Nietzsche or people around this time trying to deal with the same issues that Nietzschean nihilism deals with are seeing a being God connection, right? That's also already there back in the Islamic Neoplatonists of the Middle Ages, right? It's there in Ibn Sina probably more than anyone else. But yeah, and that's something which is useful to read this entire essay with that double voice in your head of whenever Heidegger is objecting to something happening to being, imagine the religious man's objection to those things happening with God, right? Yeah. And that voice is definitely sounding throughout, but it's being not God, because he's not simply willing to say that it's God, right? In part because of Nietzsche's own critique here, by the way. Right. But absolutely. So yeah, that's it. Well spotted on both those points, that both of them get double voiced in that way. Okay, that's going on to first reactions. Joe, do you want to give us your first reaction to this? I know you haven't read the last 3 pages, but.
Well, actually, you're going to help me very much here by guiding me to begin with page 100 to know where I'm entering the conversation. I find it delightful that this topic is being raised, because it directly focuses on many, many cross currents in my current interests. In the first pages, I don't know how many there were from the very beginning, which is mostly just recounting Nietzsche, I was not being intrigued by the reading, not only the style, but just, I'd been over this, or somehow it wasn't catching my attention. I was puzzled by the depth of what nihilism means and what we actually mean by the term. And so I like distinctions, but I was getting bored a little bit, so that's why I lay it down. Mm-hmm. I'm very pleased that I picked it up most recently, just as we approached the conversation. So first reaction is what I've mostly learned since we've been talking here today. On the side, I've been trying to relate many of these other things because I've spent so much time now. You guys don't know, but my sister died. And so I'm now alone in the house. And that means at least that I'm no longer interrupted continuously. And now I'm fully ensconced in the challenges of state management and all the financial tanglements of involved there. And I won't go into any other details, just to say that I now have time to read more stuff. So I was reading Mises, a long neglected tome, and trying to get into his philosophical background because I want to see how it relates. Thank you for cluing me into some further investigation into Max Weber's influence and Nietzsche's influence on Weber, because that greatly fascinates me. I'm also, as I said last time, very much getting into Karl Popper's discussion, some of which is, takes me astray and it doesn't hold my attention, but some things really does catch me. So philosophy of science and what is truth, what's real, what do we know is true? This is central to what my values now are focusing on. So thank you very much, Jason. And that's my first impression.
Great. Good.
One real quick note for Joe. One of the Weber's readings that I found very helpful when discussing science is his Science as a Vocation.
Yeah.
And
as vocation.
Science as vocation.
Yes.
And that's where the term disenchantment was first used.
Yes. And the iron cage.
Disenchantment? Okay.
Disenchantment of the modern world was first coined by Max Weber.
Yes.
In Science as Vocation. So I highly recommend.
I'll do more reading there. I'm very, very interested in the history of ideas, as well as what they are, of course.
Yeah, and I think it's first of all, it's a great essay. You should definitely read it for understanding Weber and Weber's own motivation, because he's not just describing how science, is and should be, something like that, as well as some of his understandings of its sort of problematic period in the modern age, something like that. But it's also very much autobiographical. This is clearly his own standard and
the vocation of science.
Science as a vocation.
Science as a vocation. I trying to memorize that.
Right.
Thank you.
Right. And besides the disenchantment of the world idea, which, by the way, you also find echoed in his sociological works, is the distinction between charismatic legitimacy and bureaucratic legitimacy, for example. Besides the disenchantment, he also speaks of the iron cage, or of an age of visionaries without spirit and voluptuaries without heart, right? There's a certain hollowness in even the competing ideals he sees in folks around him, sense of them being lesser than the purer versions of them he finds in history, something like that. And there's definitely aspects of all of that: disenchantment, iron cage, with specialists and voluptuaries, that echo Nietzsche's last man kind of criticisms. Weber is somewhat haunted by the thought that someone as impressive psychologically to him as Nietzsche, in his acuity, might diagnose Weber as having the ideals of one of the last men, right? A superficially concerned with rationalism to the point where he's lost depth and lost understanding of depth. So the fact that he is susceptible to that he could be wounded by that thought is kind of a proof that it's not simply just as an assessment of Weber, but he's sensitive to it. Anyway, that Craig is right that that's the place to start for understanding Weber on those questions of method, and the connection between those connections of method and, if we can put it this way, his peak morals, his peak ethical concerns, something like that. Science, yeah, okay. All right, Dan, first reactions to this one.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
So let's see. So I think when I started to read Heidegger about 3 years ago, I read the essay in the Theology book that you guys are reading now. And as it happened, I was just about in the middle of the beaten track. So I read it now in that version a second time.
Yep.
And it's probably, I need to try to be on the same page with you guys. I have that book. And let's see what else. So I think I read once I started reading Heidegger 3 years ago. I also read pretty much the main authors from the German idealism, and I read about 2-3 years ago all Nietzsche's works, including The Will to Power. So I am familiar with that. And with Heidegger, I read all his 4 books on Nietzsche, plus the one with on the second meditation. There is kind of a minor one, I think it was a 4. So I am familiar with this kind of. I agree with you that this is kind of a summary of those 4 books in a way. And for me, so this essay, I think there are a few things, like one that you mentioned, I really like this, like to understand Nietzsche in the Platonic tradition, like how Heidegger is doing his saying, is the last major one, and kind of the Platonic tradition ends with him, and it kind of ends it's a dead end, and we need a new start or something like that. And I really like that, reading that kind of Heidegger's reading of the entire history in that way, starting with Plato and ending up with Nietzsche. And the topic of nihilism, I really like that. It's a very important topic for me. Like I read it in Dostoevsky and I don't know, Kierkegaard and Junger and so other. And I think, and I don't think anyone did such a good job as Heidegger at trying to understand it. And I really love that. And also one another thing that I really like here is, this kind of God is dead, to try to understand, usually these days, you believe in God or don't believe in God, like a statement that God is dead doesn't make any sense to people. Like it's how God exists or doesn't exist, and there is Nietzsche saying that he died, and there is another, I think in the Twilight of Idols, he says something like 2000 years and not a single new God. So it's,
Yes.
gods not only died, but also expect them to come into being, or like to appear and come. And to me, this is kind of like, it's a new level of understanding of divinity, gods, and so on. And try to follow Heidegger there. I find that very fascinating to go with him and go into that. And I think there are a few more, but pretty much these are the main points for me.
Yep. So obviously there's also places in, I don't know if obviously, there are places in Heidegger himself where that issue comes back again when he talks about, the waiting for the last God kind of attitude that you get in some of his unpublished work from the 30s and last works. But we can come back to that. So on the issue of metaphysics as starting with Plato and ending with Nietzsche, one of the things we'll see in the next couple of sessions where we go to reading this is that it doesn't simply start with Plato, but it's bigger than that. But yes, he makes the claim at the very beginning of this essay that metaphysics in Nietzsche has exhausted all of its possibilities and is now a dead end, right? He hasn't necessarily proven that. He certainly asserted that. The section at the very end of this where he generalizes from his problems with Nietzsche to his problems with the whole tradition are really where he starts making the claim that the need now is for a transition to another beginning, something like that. And that's not based simply on an assessment of the tradition from inside of itself that its possibilities have been exhausted, but on a peak it could have contained that he sees missing in it, something like that. He Heidegger sees a standing absence in the history of metaphysics. And we'll can assess some of that at the end of it, but it's as though he said the most important event that has ever happened in history is that being didn't speak to you face to face, something like that. And you can put that in sort of the religious tradition or something like that. There is a standing non-event that occurs throughout the history of Western metaphysics, according to Heidegger, and that standing non-event is it's revealed especially in the culmination of Western metaphysics in Nietzsche, if Nietzsche is its culmination, because that's where you notice that being has been reduced to nothing, something like that. And this now highlights for us the fact that nothing happening to being was kind of the ongoing meaning or unity of this historical period or event. Now, a huge part of that is borrowed from Nietzsche's own understanding of nihilism as a history. Nietzsche has a whole understanding of Western history since Plato specifically, or Socrates, as being nihilism. And that way of understanding Western history in that kind of broad sweep is something Heidegger is adopting. He has learned this from Nietzsche, if I can put it this way. So he is agreeing with a significant portion of that. Kind of put it this way: historical phrasing and understanding of philosophical doctrines, including unchanging philosophical doctrines, as having a historical life influence, being part of the essence of civilization. He agrees with Nietzsche on that. The particular criticism of Western philosophy that you get in Nietzsche and that you get from him are entirely different. They're almost pointing in opposite directions, which again we'll get to at the end of this essay. Okay, it's one of the reasons this essay is important to me and all of Heidegger's work is because it is the place where you can see most clearly, most on the surface, the way in which Heidegger disagrees sharply with Nietzsche and yet is indebted to him. Joe?
I was trying to interpret or digest the meaning of this idea that all of Western philosophy, from Plato to the modern or something, is nihilism.
Mm-hmm.
And does that mean like you could just wipe it clean because it doesn't count to anything anymore?
No,
I mean, I didn't think so. But
it does
I don't
not.
understand.
So I mean, this is going to take us like to part 3 for a second, but okay, let's just jump there, right? What does Nietzsche mean by nihilism, right? Nietzsche means by nihilism that the highest values devalue themselves, that there's something going on in the posited highest values, that they're unstable in some way, and that they're self-refuting in some way. And the unfolding of this logic plays out through long periods of time and is only gradually revealed. It's only gradually revealed what the essence or tendency or effective meaning of this or that high ideal is, right? Plato's high ideal of a pure ideal world behind things that could order and structure them and tell us what direction change should happen and so on, is revealed over the course of time to be without effective power, because it starts off being something which is meant to govern men's conduct, and then people notice the yawning gap in between the ideal and the apparent, or the real as opposed to the ideal as they come to believe it. So they think that the material and real and the low is basically uninfluenceable by the high because they're too disparate from one another. And then in a concern for making effective, they turn away from high ideals to what is effective in this world. And this leads them to a notion of reality as effectiveness, which eventually reveals the previously posited ideal as being without power of that kind and thus unreal, right? So God as an outside history, outside time regulating thing is seen as being completely ineffectual. This ideal is not realizable, and if not realizable, then without purpose for man. And if without purpose for man, then should be replaced by something of man's own purposes, by man's own purposes. So you get a kind of insurrection by man against the uselessness of the ideal that is so far above him that he cannot reach it, right? Something like that. And this is an example for Nietzsche of how a value can refute itself, right? It's not just something that a later reaction has, but there can be an instability in the ideal itself that causes it to decay, to fall apart over time. And when he talks about nihilism in Western history, he's talking about that you start with positing all of your ideals beyond the world, and then when you lose all faith in anything beyond the world affecting the world, you're left with a sense of meaninglessness in that the place you are trying to import all your meaning from looks empty. So what becomes the opposite of that previous ideal? The answer is something like cynicism or effectiveness, but experienced as valueless, right? There is a concern with the cynically effective because that's effective and the ideal isn't. But precisely because it was drawn in contrast to the ideal, it doesn't have to be ideal. It's drawn in contrast to the moral. It doesn't have to be moral, right? It ceases to be an ethically governing, and it becomes a merely expediently governing. And so it's pure calculation. And as Nietzsche puts it, the question why finds no answer. You only know abilities to do things. You don't know what you should do, right? So the way in which the values posited too abstractly decay, fall apart, that's kind of what Nietzsche means by nihilism. And then Nietzsche goes deeper as a psychologist, and he says, well, part of the reason that happened was the reason that the ideals were projected into an unattainable, beyond the world, is because the person doing the projecting couldn't stand the aspect of the world that projected reality doesn't have, right? He projected it into the heavens because the earth is too sordid. He made it too morally pure because life is too morally tainted for him, right? It's the world is whitewashed in the ideal because the person doing the projecting, doing the whitewashing, hates aspect of the world. Question, Joe?
This describes describes every socialist or authoritarian person I've ever met. They've got an ideal plan as how to run the world.
It may well, but for Nietzsche, it describes Western history. It describes everybody, not just small subsets of people. But again,
the stuff I laugh at keeps repeating itself every time you turn around, every age,
the point that I'm making is that for Nietzsche, this is not a term of distinction that only a few people in Western history suffer from. He's saying it all suffers from it. Sorry, Dan, you had a comment.
Yeah, I agree with your interpretation, but I also to me, we have this kind of, since you mentioned also Max Weber, we have this tendency, we have truth, and truth starts going after other values and taking them down, and then they turns against itself and takes itself down. We have talking about nihilism, Ivan Dostoevsky, Ivan Karamazov, when he rejects God in name of justice, he says a world where children suffer is not a just world. So we take down God, and we take down the entire world, and take down whatever, and we go after, with truth, with truth you take down everything. You take justice, you take, I don't know, morality, you take God, you take down, and then at the end you realize the truth has no foundation, and you take down truth also. So kind of the values are destroying themselves.
Yes, and you're right that some of Nietzsche's diagnosis of it is that this happens with the war between the values themselves, and sometimes it's the incoherence in the values themselves. But he does say things like that the will to truth is what leads us to the will to truth, which was stoked up by this belief that the truth is a pure ideal above reality, something like that. Eventually leads us to question that schema itself, right? It's our intellectual probity, our hard-headed, unwillingness to be deceived that leads us to question Plato's positing of the noumenal world as a thing in itself, something like that, right? So yes, there's an element in Nietzsche where he thinks that the psychological motivation of the original projection has something nihilistic in it. There's also an element of just the values at war with each self, which is like an internal incoherence question of is the structure, is the structure internally coherent or incoherent? But I don't think for Nietzsche the coherence thing is the primary thing. It's not primarily that these values cannot be made compatible with each other. It's that they cannot be made compatible with life. Right? There's something about life itself that the otherworldly ideals are incompatible with, because they were projected as different from the world precisely because there were aspects of the world that were not accepted. There's an element of revolt and resentment that is involved at the base of the ideal projection itself, according to Nietzsche. Right? The cynical psychologist in him sees any desire to put the ideal outside the world as a hatred of an aspect of the world. And so he's diagnosing a kind of psychological resentment of some of the conditions of life, some of the tragedy of life, in idealism itself. And Nietzsche situates that at a different moment in time. The moment when the tragic worldview, which accepted those darker aspects of life, was superseded by the rationalist worldview, especially of Socrates, that tried to idealize what should be and judge the tragic out of existence, so to speak, right? Or think that the tragic shouldn't exist and can be reformed away in an ideal world or something. That's the place where Nietzsche locates the change. The change from the tragic worldview to the rationalist worldview, the change from the pre-Socratics to the Socratics, Socrates the man, right, is the place where this change occurs for early Nietzsche in The Birth of Tragedy, for example, right? And what Nietzsche is saying is that all such idealisms, including rationalism, not just idealisms like religions, are at bottom have a nihilistic component because they have a distaste for something essential to life component, right? They're at war with the world, right? And so that's the underlying what Nietzsche sees as the bottom level of nihilism is that no to life, that nihilism of pessimism that Nietzsche then contrasts with the nihilism of strength, which is going to get rid of the no to life, but is going to face the bleakness of whatever is, whatever. And that's what he thinks can lead to a revaluation of all values. The revaluation of all values solution to this is that you need to have all your evaluation being done not by people who are fooling themselves that they're the one doing it out of a dislike of life, but out of a yes to life and conscious that they're the ones doing the legislating. So the ideal of a rationalistic purifier of the world, projecting things that they pretend they only discovered, is replaced by the conscious creation of human values by people who know that that's what they're doing and who affirm rather than deny the tragic realities of life, right? So that's in Nietzsche's own self-understanding, that's the overturning he thinks he's accomplishing, and that's why Plato and Socrates are the main enemy for him, right? It's why he invokes Dionysus as a figure from the tragic age of the Greeks. It's supposedly bringing back this lower level of pre-rational tragic religiosity or something, right? But the point is, there's a coherent version of what counts as nihilism in Nietzsche, but having described it that way, it's an ongoing event. It's a long-standing length of the civilization, 2,000-year structure that has been unfolding in Western history. It's not something that just came about in the 19th century. Only some of its more extreme symptoms are apparent in the 19th century when you get the nihilists of Russia, the nihilists of Dostoevsky, who no longer believe in God and therefore think that everything is permitted, right? That kind of nihilism you get as a culmination of the decay of the previous ideals, but they're still judging the reality around them by an ideal it cannot possibly live up to. And when they see that it does not live up to it, they don't negate the ideals, they want to negate the reality, right? That's his diagnosis of what the idealistic nihilists of Russian socialism in the late 19th century were about, right? But to Nietzsche, that symptom, the underlying resentment that positive ideals in the first place is coming out and being expressed, right? There was a dislike of reality as it is already at the base of it, and now that's openly in revolt with nothing else in the way, right? And that gets you nihilism in the bomb throwing sense, right? So go ahead.
Yeah, can I? So you guys related to this, and you guys mentioned this. You discussed it last week, and didn't have a chance to say something there. So you guys something like said that the science, offer truths, and we have models and stuff like that. So, and these days, like I'm a classical statistician, and these days we are kind of on the defensive. It's this data science is coming after us, and there is no more truth, there is just pure prediction. There are no more models, there are no more, and like it's, to me, it's kind of like the science is under attack by technology, and this is kind of is coming there. It's Nietzsche, it's nihilism.
Yes.
It's there is no more truth in the sciences these days, and probably this trend is going to overtake everything. There is no more truth, there is no model, it's just pure prediction, and that's it. And
Yeah, so let's you're right, but now let's connect that thought to the previous. So the connection is that when you see the ideals as being just tools for human purposes, you consciously decide that artificial human purposes are what's actually driving all of it, and you get an instrumental and utilitarian attitude towards questions of truth. You only want to know what you can do with it, right? And this puts effectiveness considerations and power considerations and will to power at the base of everything. Nietzsche is the metaphysics of the will to power, the claim that the will to power is what is actually creating and producing the sensible world, as well as the most salient aspects of the sensible world, right? There's a place in Beyond Good and Evil where Nietzsche says, where do we get the idea of the will to power? And the answer is the world viewed from the inside as what the will experiences itself would be will to power and nothing else. The point being that even objective facts just present themselves to us as things which resist our will, right? So the only meaning that a fact being objective has is that it is resisting my will so far because I haven't found the button to push to get it to do what I want, right? But as soon as I find that button, I have tamed it, I have brought it into my technological system, I have reduced it to standing reserve, to raw material, to orderable energy, and I can order it now, right? So man is sent on the quest of ordering everything that is to his own purposes, right? And that winds up changing science into a technology and reason into an instrument. And what is in charge of the instruments and the science and the will to truth? The answer is the drives. The drives are in charge. The low is in charge of the high, right? The opposite is Platonic understanding, right? So I mean, and there's no question that is when that is happening, it's Nietzscheanism as a philosophy that is happening, and its subjectivism is at the base of that because it winds up viewing everything as an artifact. Everything is something that men have created, projected. If the model is more important than the thing, or the model is the thing, right? The thing is just the correct model of it, right? And the correct model of it is correct because you can use it, right? The adage at the early part of modernity, as opposed to the late form in Nietzsche, is what you get in Hobbes. We know only what we make, right? So the idea that anything which is not artificially constructed has something irreducibly mysterious about it, something unconquered about it, something useless about it, that becomes just the Kantian thing in itself, leftover remnant. And after Hegel, we decide that that's just reason, right? It's just the unconquered area that reason is in principle going to conquer, but hasn't gotten to yet. And the difference of Nietzsche compared to Hegel in that is not the conquering subjectivism. It's just that it's no longer rational. It's now drive driven. It's now instinct driven. It's now the will to power as a principle of life expressing itself through us, right? So we are just little avatars of eternal will to power wanting things, right? And the world is at bottom will, right? So that's the consistent Nietzschean philosophy that Heidegger is here diagnosing as the end of metaphysics, right? This is where metaphysics eventually drives everything, as reason instrumentally conquers everything. It dethrones even itself because it recognizes that it is a driven thing. It is a motivated thing, right? And the same objectifying science turned on the human being as opposed to on the world around him creates a rationalistic science of the drives, which just reveals that underlying instinct is in charge, right? Even of science as an activity, right? So that's also, by the way, the connection this has for someone like Weber and science as a vocation discussion, because that's disturbing to him. He wants to think that his vocation in science is a service to truth and is not simply a reflection of some instinctual drive or some desire for prestige motivated through what the society values around him and so on, right? And that's a tension for Weber, because he's not simply a Nietzschean and he's not simply a classical man, right? He doesn't simply believe in a Platonic ideal of truth, but and he hears Nietzsche's criticisms, but he's not simply a Nietzschean, and he can't abandon an ideal of truth independent of drives and subjective desires. Anyway, that's how we can tie some of these things together. You're right that there's that a sense of disappearance of the truth. The sense of disappearance of the truth goes along with what's disappearing is the sense that the truth is not our creation. The sense that the truth is there before us. The truth is still there in Nietzsche, but it's there as a human construct for human purposes. It's the kind of error without which creatures like us could not live, right? So it's a value, but as a value, it's a construction, it's a projection. All these things in Nietzsche also tie up to issues of methodology and nominalism in logic and things like that. Craig?
So doesn't it also tie into that there's no more sacredness in nature? Nature is only something to be used. It's raw material to be used. Oil is to be extracted from the ground. Trees are to be cut down.
Correct. And not
all of that. And until you address that underlying attitude, you're not going to get very far with people who live in that will to power.
So first of all, correct, and second of all, that's this framing of it as that's what's going on in modernity, that's what's going on in modern technology, that's what's going on in capitalism, right? Is exactly the framing that you get in the backlashes against it from environmentalist movement or from Gaia or from trying to re-enchant the world in New Ageism. All of them are seeing those aspects of the completely rationalizing, subjective, conquer the world modern impulse. There are elements of it that they regard as distorting, limiting, unholy, impious, etc., assaultive, whatever. And that whole dichotomy is Nietzscheism on the one hand, and people reacting to it without even knowing it's Nietzscheanism. They're reacting to it as something which is violating their previous cherished ideals, right? Which they don't really believe in anymore. That's why the reaction to it is not blasphemy, it's pollution, right? As though blasphemy wasn't always a concern with pollution of a certain kind, right? Joe?
Just to clarify my understanding, so truth is sort of an instrumental thing that man creates as a tool in which they're making things in the real world comprehensible to themselves. Now, truth is you might say there's truth one, which is the real truth, and there's been truthiness or something, fake truth. But the real truth, of course, corresponds to what Heidegger claims is when you're thrown into the world, you then can perceive it, and that's the reality of it. And truth is when you can describe that in some useful or accurate way, whereas truthiness is just something that makes up to deceive other people.
But the usefulness of the way of describing and the way that you just mentioned it is still annexed to Nietzsche, right? The Nietzschean is standing ready to have the fact that your description has to be useful be all he needs to colonize your theory, right?
Yes, I thought I was describing Nietzsche. So when we go to what Heidegger is doing to modify that and amend that, now I'm interested. Listening.
Yes. So, I mean, what's the fundamental critique? I mean, we're jumping way ahead here, but what's the fundamental critique towards all that, right? So he asks, what is happening to being, as he understands being, in this Nietzschean metaphysics of the will to power? And he says, being has been transformed into a value. That's what's happened to it, right? We've taken the essence of what is, and we've turned it into value. Right.
Label of truth.
So he cites the principle from Nietzsche that art is worth more than truth. And he also says we possess art so that we do not perish of the truth, right? But that art is worth more than truth is a value principle, right? So the core of Nietzsche's understanding of both truth as a value and of its subordination to art is all value thinking. What is happening to being in all of it is that being has been transformed into a value. Okay, so is being understood as being when being is seen as a value or is seen as value? And Heidegger says no, right? So what is happening to being itself when everything that is seen as value? And Heidegger's answer is nothing is happening to being. And what he means by that is that the being made nothing, the negation, the nullifying of anything being could be, say, or do, or communicate to man is occurring. The ongoing event is that being is not talking to man. Man is not listening to being. There is no communion between man and being. Philosophy, thinking has ceased. Right? And he's not saying this is some ideal. He's describing what he sees happening. He's testifying, but testifying to what he sees with his eyes or with his mind, right? And that simply reflecting what you see actually happening in those terms is, to Heidegger, what thinkingly responding to being is. Thinkingly responding to being is recording and objectively answering, objectively relating what you see happening on this highest metaphysical plane, if I want to put it that way. Joe?
Would you say that that is the steady state value? That's the eternal value. That's just what it is, or is it some kind of evolutionary thing that we've arrived at?
It's not an evolutionary thing, which would be trying, the whole frame of trying to understand these things as evolutionary goals of us is Nietzsche. It's biologizing. It's trying to see the lower as the cause of the higher, and to see that we might have drives because they were put there by evolution for evolution's purposes, which is just a thinly described way of saying life's purposes, which is a thinly described way of saying the will to power's purposes, right? That's still Nietzsche. The evolutionary understanding of these things is Nietzsche all the way down. And that's why it was used for, even social Darwinist ways in his own day. But what Heidegger would say instead is, instead, being makes a claim on man. Being appropriates thinkers. This is related to the turnaround you see in the allegory of the cave, when people turn away from the images and towards the true reality. That is a call from being. A call to a being, and he experiences this as and describes it as the thinker being appropriated by being. It's not a matter of some action. He's reversing the agency sign in Nietzsche, which is in Nietzsche, the agency sign is always the emphasis on what man is doing. And Heidegger is reversing that to what is the truth doing? What is being doing? And one of the things that being does is it appropriates some men to speak for it, right? Thinkers are those who pay attention to what is happening and are appropriated by being and speak it. This is like the role of an Old Testament prophet, that their role is to hear the revelation coming to them from on high. But instead of the revelation coming to them on high because God spoke to them, they were attentive to what is, they see what is, and they say it. And that is the action of hearing being, listening to being, and saying what is happening to being. And Heidegger's reading of the history of thought is all the thinkers, even the most metaphysical thinkers, even Nietzsche is doing this. Even when he's propounding a philosophy that is going to make nothing happening to being, he is still listening to the unfolding logic of how being is appearing to man, right? And he describes this as, for each thinker, some portion of the destinying way that being has laid out for itself is revealed. There's an ongoing revelation from one thinker to another of a little segment of how being can appear to man that each of them understands, manages to reflect, manages to say. None of them are being itself. All of them are just glimpses of revelation from being itself. Okay, so that's the structure he's putting all this in, and what the calling of thinking is that he's talking about. And you can relate this back to the thing about science and vocation. Weber wants science to have a vocation of listening to and telling the truth, regardless of ends, regardless of purposes, right? He wants it to be a calling. He wants there to be a way in which it is part of truth speaking to man, right? And this is appealing both to an older sense of the truth as existent and merely discovered that you had in Plato, and also echoes this aspect of Heidegger, that there's a being called by being, piety to thought, that is just about honestly testifying as to what you see happening. Now, what's different about the Platonic understanding and the Heideggerian understanding is Heidegger has definitely got the accent on the what's happening, the ongoing event aspect, the activity aspect of it, whereas in Plato, the truth was the unchanging. The truth was the stable. So the temporal sign has changed dramatically, but otherwise this would be an ideal that Plato would recognize. The ideal that the truth that you merely uncover, that you did not make, and it is not a matter of your purposes, is the thing which sets the standard for the philosopher. That's an ideal that Heidegger effectively has taken over entire, but it's now no longer tied to there being anything timeless about the truth that the allegiance is to. To Heidegger, the being that is being listened to has become the activity of the transcendental, or the activity of the transcendent, right? It's an activity, right? Truth has a history, right? It's an ongoing revelation. It's not up to an ongoing discovery, an ongoing revelation. It's no longer a static behind the scenes, occasionally glimpsed. It's now something with a life and history and activity to it. Greg?
So without going down the evolutionary rabbit hole, what about some of the work on process thinking? And when you mentioned activity.
Yes, you're thinking about Whitehead, for example?
Whitehead, for example,
yes.
Activity and process are very similar.
Yes, and there was definitely a whole move in the 19th century in this direction, and part of it was related to concern with vitalism, part of it was related to theories of progress, sort of was related to philosophies of history. There was a whole raft of people who thought that if we move from understanding of state to understanding of process, if we make change the primitive term and the end states only the states only the dividing lines between the changes, that this would revolutionize our thinking in some way. I don't know that actually pans out. I think methodologically, people have found the state versus process views effectively convertible to one another. They're dual. So it doesn't fundamentally shift what you say to experience it one way rather than the other. But there's no question in the 19th century, this was the vogue. That's what you get in Hegel, right? Hegel is all about the dialectical process, not the stages along the process, but the moving thing through history. And Jung is all about the self as the thing which integrates what the changes through time rather than any of the states that he changed through. And so there's absolutely this concern with the dynamic. Two aspects of that. One of this is partly reactions against the static nature of Platonism, going back to the old Fluxist Heracliteanism underneath, right? So the idea that the underlying is the becoming, and part of that is the decay of the static being that Nietzsche is describing. Nietzsche himself is a philosopher of becoming, right? He wants to be a philosopher of becoming. He's going to claim that the becoming is the real, right? And Heidegger has to some degree inherited that. The fact that when he thinks of something to contrast to being, he doesn't think of the good as Plato did, which is a timeless outside, but time. We saw in the late part of Basic Problems of Phenomenology that the role of time in Heidegger's metaphysics is quite similar to the role of the idea of the good beyond being in Plato's, but structurally, I mean. But he's definitely has the temporal dimension to him. For Heidegger, though, there's another reason for this, which is that he's trying to stay closer to the merely phenomenal evidence, right? We experience being as enduring presence, as an enduring, and therefore as an in-timedness, right? And the move in Plato to think of the noetic and the true as the timeless is something Heidegger is definitely resisting. So how much of that is him just imbibing the concerns of the modern age, and how much of it is it the whole modern age correcting an error of Plato, right? The philosophies disagree on the point. but yes, that is definitely in play here. And Heidegger himself is clearly on the side of being is an activity, it's an event, it's a verb, and a significant portion of what has been missed in the history of metaphysics is that it has been a what and a noun and not a verb, right? He wants being understood as a verb. It is an ongoing event that being is happening. Excellent questions. Okay, so is this ideal that he's holding out against what he sees happening in the history of metaphysics clear or completely obscure? Joe is saying it's relatively clear, but on mute.
No, I was affirming. This is quite a good explication. Thank you very much. And so being is, well, I get a more anchored, I guess I'm getting a view or a review of being from being in time. Because, well, when we go back to Heidegger, we always think, okay, he's going to end up back there.
So yes, and there's two places in this essay where he brings up being in time explicitly, and one of them is the beginning, where he's explaining what he's going to do in this essay, and he says, in some ways, all the reflections here are just a way of trying to, understand a single experience I had in being in time, and the single experience is the unthought nature of being in the history of the West, right? So the point is the beginning, that the motivation for being in time is that it was staggering to him, Heidegger, that what being means doesn't seem to be something that moderns can easily answer, right? It's not that no one ever talked about it. It's that they don't know what they mean by being, right? And large numbers of them think that it is so trivial that you can't that it's not worth investigating, and others think it's so obscure that you cannot say anything about it. They think contradictory things about it when they think about it at all. But okay, so that's like an initial puzzle that gives him his problematic in the first place. How true are some of the extreme things he says about the tradition's disregard of being? That's an open question, because what he's really claiming is that the tradition did think about being, but it thought about being as the being of the beings, as what is as such, right? Its notion of being was what is as such, what all beings that are share, something like that, as the most common, as the most underlying. He traces that back to Aristotle, but you can find it before him. That is before Aristotle. That's not being. It's not the being that is talking to man that Heidegger is talking about. It's not an activity, for one thing, and it doesn't have the same kind of history that Heidegger is seeing in it. Because what Heidegger is saying is basically, if we look at the history of metaphysics, we see that that individual philosophers do give a meaning to the being of beings, but it keeps changing, right? It's got this dynamic history, and the dynamic history seems to be missed, right? The dynamic history is just simply interpreted as a set of disagreements between particular thinkers about what they think the being of beings is, right? You imagine a static, timeless field in which 100 different voices each testify what they think the being of the beings is, and none of them notice that it's changing. They just think of the change as them disagreeing with one another statically. And Heidegger thinks they're not disagreeing with one another statically. Instead, what's happening is there's an ongoing and unfolding history of it. They're all talking about the same structure, and the same thing is talking to all of them, but they're not paying any attention to that sameness. Okay. To some degree, though, this might reduce to the criticism being, none of these previous thinkers anticipated being in time. None of them wrote being in time in 400 BC, and he doesn't know why. Or not only being in time, because he has some revisions to that. There's some of these things here which he didn't himself arrive at until the early 30s. So is the problem with the tradition that it did not see farther than Heidegger himself saw at the time when he published Being in Time, right? Is that the standing criticism of the Western tradition? That there's a particular thing that Heidegger only noticed in the early 1930s that all previous philosophers had failed to notice. I mean, it's entirely plausible that there are things which Heidegger noticed in the early 30s that all previous philosophers had failed to notice. But most people would not consider that a damning indictment of Western philosophy, right? They would just say there's something innovative about Heidegger. He has discovered something new, right? So how much of this criticism of the whole tradition lands is something we have to assess for ourselves, right? And I want to point out on page 108, he is wrapping up the discussion of Nietzsche, which I want to get to a little more detail at some point, but he calls the nothing happening to being is radical killing. What does he mean by that? It is the making dead of what is. And one way to think about that is the disenchantment Craig is talking about. Man lived in a world that was alive. He lived in a world where God spoke to him, right? He lived in a world of revelation and enchantment, and metaphysics has killed it, dead. Everything living has been erased from it. It's been made into an object, and that object into a plaything of his will, right? So this is the ongoing radical killing that metaphysics accomplishes, that objectification accomplishes, that turns everything into a mere object over against man, a lifeless object that is a plaything of his will, right? That is what he is describing on page 108 as how metaphysics is radical killing. Radical killing means it was never alive, right? You change everything that was living into something which was never alive. Okay. He says the value ethic of metaphysics of the will to power is murderous in the most extreme sense because it absolutely does not let being itself take its rise, come into the vitality of its essence. Thinking in terms of values precludes in advance that being itself will attain to a coming to presence in its truth. So leaving aside what it does to how we interpret the beings as lifeless, we can never hear being if we think we're only surrounded by our own creations. We are literally left to our own devices, right? Okay. All right. Then that's the end. That's like the culmination of his criticism of Nietzsche, right? Is that what's involved in it? And you can hear echoes of that in all of in the pop culture versions of reactions to the things that people dislike about modernity. You can see it in Avatar, you know, if you want to be superficial at it, right? But this murdering that kills it is this murdering that kills at the roots first and exclusively the way of metaphysics of the will to power? Is it only the interpretation of being as a value that does not let being itself be the being that it is? If this were the case, then metaphysics before Nietzsche would have to have experienced and thought being itself in its truth, or at least to have questioned concerning it. In other words, is this criticism only of Nietzsche? Is this criticism only of late Western metaphysics? Is it only of late stage capitalism or objectification or something? Reason decay to instrumental reason. People are no longer concerned with the truth because they're nominalism and subjectivism. Answer. But nowhere do we find such experiencing of being itself. Nor are we confronted by a thinking that thinks the truth of being itself and therewith thinks truth itself as being. All right, that's the claim. And he'll say that this is the same observation that motivated being in time in the first place. Okay. So, and after that, he'll say, you know, is this true even of the pre-Platonics? He doesn't say pre-Socratics, it's pre-Platonics, but he's talking to the same people. This ongoing forgetting of being. He says the history of being begins and indeed necessarily with the forgetting of being. So he's saying that being is obscured throughout the entire history of metaphysics, right? So he has not given a giant argument that is the case here. The argument is an argument from absence. He's saying we should have found some description of how being appears to man prominently there in Parmenides, say. And if it's not there, it's because it was not experienced. If it was not experienced, it's been missing the entire time. It should have been at the foundation of how we understood objective truth, or what is speaking to us when truth happens, or what it means to be dedicated to the truth, but we don't find it. It's not there. That's the claim. Okay, so as a claim about an absence, this is obviously, you know, it's one of those staggering claims that not only needs evidence, it needs all the evidence, right? You have to examine every thinker who has ever mentioned being and truth, or any synonym for it in their own language, and detect the absence of this experience. Avicenna is going to have a word with you when you tell him that he's never thought about being, right? But if what Heidegger means by this is that they have not thought about being the way he thinks about being, then he has a somewhat easier case. If what he means by saying that the truth of being remains unthought, that is now sliding over to more like, there is a possible thought about the truth of being, which only occurred to me just now, that is unthought up to now. And thought hitherto has to go beyond where it was because of this thought. This is now not a indictment lack of what the tradition should have seen but didn't, but only we're in a new chapter now, right? Because something else has happened. Heidegger can be read both ways. When he's read the first way as criticizing Western history in much the same way Nietzsche did as nihilism, it can feel very tendentious because you have the same sort of sweeping indictments of the entire history of the West that you get in Nietzsche, with the same implicit revolutionary consequences for that. All values must be completely rethought, and all previous edifices of concern torn down and redone, right? That note is there, but when you look for the evidence for it is that something is missing, and the something missing is something that Heidegger is going to offer you as better or beyond. Okay, so there's an aspect of this which is very much promissory note. It's very much Heidegger sees a missing peak and he's pointing towards the peak and saying, over there, there's something over there, right? Can he show you what the something over there is? Only in glimpses. He can show you that being has a history. He can show you that there's something like an activity of the transcendent, or that the notion of truth changes, right? That's pretty much what he's shown. He hasn't shown more than that. But the amount that he reads into that fact is, staggering and meant to be staggering, right? I want to some other echoes of this notion. Okay, let's first, before we get to echoes of it and his justification for it, let's make sure we can hear him say it. What is he saying? He's saying the non-appearing of being to man is an event, and that event should be understood as being's withdrawal. Change the sign of the activity. It's not a man's doing, it's a being's doing. That is not a being, but being with capital B, right, is withdrawn from, hidden from, veiled from man's thought. It's as though the would-be prophet is noticing that God is not speaking to him. They're not on speaking terms anymore. He's neglected him too much. Okay. He also will say, he gives some understanding / explanation of how or why this is happening. Part of it is that the truth of being, or the unveiling of being, or the revelation of being, is hidden behind the different interpretations of what being is, right? So you have a what each time understood as an unchanging thing, but no hearkening to the fact of the call, or the activity of the transcending, or the instability of it, right? The dynamism of being is not being attended to. The life of being is not being attended to, something like that. So it's not nothing that he's pointing to when he's saying that there's a lack here. It's not a complete absence. But he is definitely understanding this as not some one man's doing, or even 50 men's doings. Being is hidden and withdrawn, not because it couldn't be discovered, but because it hasn't been. Okay, and when he points in some of his middle 30s works and later works to another beginning, he's saying something like the original understanding of aletheia was one way in which being appeared to man, and then it was immediately hidden, and this is the way it was hidden. But another beginning could pay attention to the active aspects of being. Okay. But all of this is meant to rekindle something like a connection to a transcendent and true that is not simply man's product and is not simply the subjectivity that you get in Nietzschean metaphysics, right? The reaction in Nietzschean metaphysics is not changed by this. It's standing there. It's not only that, it's the basis of it. The reason the metaphysics is something to get out of is because in the end, it drops you into Nietzschean nihilism. One way to think about that is man was first in a natural whole that had a human realm as a small subset inside of it, where he lived in his creations in art. And as civilization and metaphysics has progressed, rationalism and subjectivity have blown out the human sphere to the limits, all the way to the limits. So there's nothing outside the human sphere. Everything is inside the city. Everything is part of man's construction. Everything is a work of art. Nietzsche says the world is a work of art that gives birth to itself, right? Everything is artificial, right? And that means that the natural world has disappeared. The natural environment has disappeared. The original mystery in which man is placed has disappeared. So there's lots of tendencies that go along with that. The making the city everything and making politics everything. The totalizing nature of it, meaning there's no claims beyond it. There's no appeal from it. The artificiality of the things constructed being openly admitted, meaning that there's no value in the non-artificial anymore because everything's artificial, right? All of those aspects of where Nietzschean metaphysics leaves you, you can see are reasons why even any memory of the traditional Platonic or older metaphysics would have objections to the Nietzschean world, to the modern world, something like that. There are traditionalist reasons for being dissatisfied with Nietzschean modernism. And Heidegger is playing on and harping on those desires while not going back to them, right? He's not saying that the older versions of those things were correct, but he's still expecting that how to put it, the moral frame of listening to the truth as discovery of the truth as a highest calling, a piety of thought. He's still expecting that to be there from the pre-Nietzschean ancient metaphysics. Dan, question.
Yeah, so I think there is Heidegger says in some place that we can never go from beings to being. So that's a major claim. So even if there are artificial, like as they are today, most of them, but also the way they are, we cannot jump from beings to being, even in the old ways, like in the natural way, the way you spoke. So, and I think he tried to make this clear with the ontological difference, like the direction is always from being to beings. We cannot move from beings to being. And when we try to generalize, like look at beings and try to come up with an explanation what they are, try to generalize or to find what's common and say that's being, that's metaphysics to Heidegger. So, and we can never make that movement. And I think Heidegger is saying that, especially later Heidegger, that we cannot do that. And
yes, but he still thinks that being talks to you without that medium, but everything that is a being.
Yeah, it talks to us.
So the point is he needs simultaneously for it to be impossible to go from the beings back to being, but also not only possible, but appropriating you a duty to hearken to and listen to what being itself says. So when being itself says something, how, where, to whom, right?
Yeah.
And the answer cannot be by what is common to all beings for the reasons you gave, right? But it still has to be through some medium and at some time and to some thinker. And there's going to be a being involved with an A in front of it that is not on the other side of the ontological difference.
Yeah, and that's like it's human. It's like, as you say, we are appropriated by being, but it's
Yes.
kind of it's a revelation, and I think that's to me,
Yes.
like the way I got into Heidegger. It's I feel like like it's almost like a matrix experience. Some things are out of joint, and you don't know why. and you try to understand why, and you go there and you give an explanation, you go there, you get an explanation, and you go there to Heidegger, you get an explanation, and suddenly if you go deeper, you see that things make sense, you know, that's the only way to say that Heidegger is right. It's like things, it's a dimension that explains a lot.
I understand what you're saying, and I agree with you that the idea that there is a directional from being itself revelation to the mind of the thinker, and in Dasein, right, as the place or site in which being appears, right, there is that intellectual intuition, immediate revelation, understanding of the direction or flow of truth from being to Dasein to the mind of man. Absolutely. But the thing is, that to pretend that there are no beings involved in that is just false. There are, right? It is not it is certainly not the case that we can arrive at what being is or means by taking all the beings and performing a mathematical operation on them, right? That is correct. It has to be something you can see in each of the beings themselves, but that's the only place you'll ever see it, right? When an artist experiences the tree in an artistically revelatory way, being is talking to them through a being, not through all beings, but beings are where being appears. It doesn't appear otherwise.
No, I agree that beings are involved also. It's not like just a pure intellectual activity. It's going through beings,
but my point is that the previous thinkers in the tradition understood that point well. When the Heraclitus is talking about listening not to me but to the Logos, he's trying to talk about that same thing. When Parmenides is talking about the way of mortals in which there is no true alliance as opposed to the way of being itself, and he's having this as a revelation presented to him by the goddess of truth, he's trying to talk about that same thing. When, for that matter, when a Matthew Arnold on Dover Beach speaks of the long withdrawing roar, he's talking about that same kind of thing. It's untrue that the rest of the tradition didn't have that experience. They did, and they spoke about it. They were not hiding all of it behind the notion of being as the logically simplest concept. They were not all Aristotelians of the metaphysics. They were poets of revelation, and they were thinkers of insight who were trying to record their own peak experiences in their own language and bring it to speech. Heidegger himself is greatly indebted to that whole tradition. There's no way he could have the tact and understanding of these things without there being peak examples of it in the people he's recording and writing about. So I agree with the statement that being has a direct pipeline revelation to man, and that's how it occurs. But that was the actual sensorium of being, understanding of the soul in the Theaetetus we just read. In Plato's language, it wasn't that it wasn't there, it wasn't described the way Heidegger describes it. And Heidegger may be closer to the phenomenology at times, fine. They're still trying to talk about it. The thing which I find less than charitable in Heidegger is, despite his very deep reading of these, many of these people, he's not, in his sweeping declarations, he's not charitable to them about how much they have actually heard of being itself. I think they have heard quite a bit. I'm much more charitable towards the tradition than he is that way. And I think that in his details, when he's engaging with a particular thinker, he often sees that himself. He's clearly learning from them. So it's almost like the sweeping declaration has to have a wipe away the past totality to it that the individual engagement with which each of the thinkers doesn't have and doesn't bear up. I see some of that is indebted to Nietzsche himself. What do I mean by that? I mean that the sweeping historical injustice to the tradition that is definitely there in Nietzsche is to some extent recapitulated in Heidegger in his lack of openness in the gross rather than in the detail to the degree to which the tradition was already listening to being. I think the tradition was actually listening to being more than he lets on, and I think he sees that at times when he's dealing with an individual thinker. He's perfectly capable of seeing that. So this is my own personal biggest issue with Heidegger, right? It's a place where I'm not sure I can go with him, right? Is I want to be more charitable to how much thinkers of the past understood being than I find him to be.
Yeah, I definitely think that he was a radical thinker and he wanted to overthrow everything, and he didn't have patience. He thought it's a dead end and it's going even deeper and deeper, and now it's like he tried with his political involvement, he tried with being in time, then he tried with the event again with the contribution to overthrow everything, and he could not do it. It was, in a way, it was a failed project, but it was an attempt, and I think we can learn a lot of things, like from what he tried and didn't work and so on.
I agree with you, and I also have plenty of respect for how much he did engage with tradition. It's not like when he said the tradition should be swept away, his way of doing that was to throw it in the dustbin and not read it and write his own things instead. He read them, right? He learned everything he could from them. And in terms of the attempting, right? There's elements of the attempting which are definitely praiseworthy, right? The attempt to get people to have some kind of a direct reattachment to truth as such, entirely meritorious from my perspective, right? And the fact that he could bring that out even in an essay like this, where he's engaging with Nietzsche on the point, right? While showing that he understands Nietzsche completely. None of it's because he doesn't understand Nietzsche. There's lots of people that react to Nietzsche because they don't understand him. They can't make head or tail of him, or they just react to him with hostility. None of that here, right? He understands him completely. And that gives weight to his own reaction against him. So there's lots of things like that in Heidegger in general, and in this essay in particular, that I extremely admire, right? It's just there's a lack of charity about how much the previous thinkers had seen of the truth. Okay, and maybe some of that is high ideal, have to do better, fine. Let's do better. Let's think. There's other places where in his general pronouncements, he's all about the humility, and they all about the just making a beginning, and all about just remaining on the way and all that kind of stuff. I wish that were more than pro forma. I wish that were lived out in his sweeping judgments of the tradition. I think if Heidegger had a less sweepingly negative judgment of the tradition, he would not give up anything that he needs, and he would just be improved.
And I also agree with you, like there were a lot of thinkers who pointed out and said there is something there, but they could not say something. They could not, I don't know, give us a story with a beginning and a middle, and said, look, like Heidegger said, like this is how being sways, and because it sways this way, this is what's going to happen. It's going to be oblivion. It's going to be for like that and that, and it says this is how it moved there at the beginning, and that's why we have this history of that what we have, and that's why we have metaphysics in the way we have it. And he said that kind of thing, and that's kind of, to me, it's his merit. It's not like, as you said, there are others who pointed there is something there, but they could not say something meaningful about that, or something like Heidegger did. Then he constructed the entire history of it.
I think others definitely have and can. There's and other thinkers from his own time and from 50 years before Nietzsche's own time, right? Who had their own version of these sweeping understandings of history and of the West, and of the roles of the critical arguments in all of it, right? That's not what's unique about Heidegger, right? The degree of which he can engage in depth with the specific philosophers in the tradition is to me much more meritorious than the things he has in common with the others doing these sweeping assessments of where we are as an understanding of our place in history, kind of thing. That sort of stuff is a almost a dime a dozen, right? And the places where he is just mimicking Nietzsche's condemnation of nihilism, there, he's just piggybacking on somebody else's prophecy, right? I that does not move me, right? Where he can see something like a a call or claim of being upon man as a duty, something like that, in a way that recalls the turning around of the allegory of the cave. That's moving to me, right? Especially when you can make the connection, right? That's the kind of thing I see missing in Nietzsche, right? Nietzsche's too cynical to confess to such experiences, right? Which doesn't mean he didn't have them, but he wouldn't think they're respectable enough to talk about, something like that. Okay, but I mean, we've moved deep into the overall assessments, which is good. We're far enough along that some of this makes sense at times. I wanted to point out the two twists at the end, right? I think Craig had already brought out the very last sentence as one of those about reason being a sick adversary of thought. That's not the actual final twist I'm thinking of. There's two aspects of the twist. The first is by reversing the direction of the causation of in Nietzsche, everything is man's agency, and he's reversed it to being's agency, of being's withdrawing, right? I want you to think about that. The twist is to think about that as an assessment of Nietzsche's own teaching or word, right? God is dead has been turned around into being has stopped speaking to man. That's what I claim is the first version of the twist, right? He's not disagreeing with the severing, but he's putting the agency and therefore the accent the other way, right? Nietzsche's God is dead is saying the supersensible or the transcendent is without any effective power, and Heidegger's version of that is man has completely cut himself off from the effective power of the transcendent. Both those statements seem to have the same content, but they have an entirely different accent, especially about what is possible after, what is possible next. That's the first twist. Okay. Now I want the second version of this is to translate that back into Nietzsche's own allegory, where he gave the madman thing, which we haven't gone over in detail, but I gather people have read it, right? This is on bottom of page 111, second to last page. First of all, he's saying that this constant passing over of what lies nearest, it is through this that we are, without noticing it, constantly accomplishing the killing in relation to being of whatever is in being. So he's agreeing with Nietzsche that we're the murderers, but the act of murder is very different from the one Nietzsche had described. That's the first point to notice. In order to pay it heed and learn to pay it heed, it may be enough for us simply to ponder for once what the madman says about the death of God and how he says it. Perhaps we will no longer pass by so quickly without hearing what is said at the beginning of the passage that has been elucidated. That the madman cried incessantly, I seek God, I seek God. Why is that a twist? What is he saying? Sorry. There's a right down at the beginning of 112, right? In these last sentences, the one who seeks God, since he cries out after God, has a thinking man perhaps here really cried out deep profundus from the depths. So he's rereading the first two lines of Nietzsche's aphorism, and he's seeing the seeking in it, as opposed to the proclamation later in it. And he's asking, is that a cry from Nietzsche, the madman's heart? So understanding there, not God in any Christian sense, but again, this connection to the transcendent. He's diagnosing in Nietzsche some longing for reattachment to being. Right? He is reading the most stridently and aggressively atheistic aphorism ever written in a way that charitably sees a desire for reconnection with being in it. So that's the second version of the twist. He's trying to say something like the way in which thinking man is appropriated by being was operative there even in Nietzsche. He might not have followed it, but it was there. So this is a very different take on this is what I'm calling the twist at the end of the essay. The twist on the end of the essay is, having given the sweeping condemnation of the radical killing involved in Nietzsche, and then generalized it to all of Western history, he then forgives Nietzsche. Okay. So that's what I'm calling the twist. And the forgiving is because he hears the echo of the desire, at least, for the reconnection with the transcendent. Okay. When I said that the essay has a twist, that's what I meant by the twist that I see that it is having. And it's easy to see that go by, because when he gets to all the condemnations of Nietzsche, it's easy to be overwhelmed by them and to think that these are, you get the point, as far as you can go. Okay. Can we reapply that to the widening from Nietzsche to the tradition? It's my own desire. Right? Let's be a little more charitable to the tradition too, in terms of how much it was already trying to be connected to being. Okay. We didn't get to all the things I wanted to get to in the. We've only gone 2 hours, but in the exposition of it. So I want to throw it open to that, because we've gotten to all the big stuff, right? We maybe didn't get to all the little stuff along the way. But are there sections of beginning or the 5th and 6th sections, especially Heidegger's own critique of Nietzsche, Heidegger's own position at the end, or the intro part where he's situating all of it? Are there any aspects of that where people have questions on particular passages we want to get to? Or have we covered all of it already? I'm leaving out the parts about just the exposition of the aphorism itself, nature of nihilism, because we actually did go over that in some detail together. Joe has no questions.
No, I was just a vacant of questioning, because I've been so overwhelmed by the revelation here, especially the stuff that I'm yet to read, but I'm going to read probably later today or tomorrow, because I want to finish this up and get this clear in my mind as we have talked about it. Plus, I'll be looking forward to the video. Mm-hmm. So, thank you.
Okay. Yeah. Craig, anything? We covered your word salad problem places.
Yeah, I think you covered it pretty well. I was actually thinking back. It was funny. One of the thoughts that came back to me was my college professor saying Heidegger took so much from Husserl and didn't even give him any credit for it. Mm-hmm. And I thought, and it was in the way he phrased it was, that's typical of what happens to an academic. Mm-hmm. And so there's a certain sort of willfulness, a certain sort of power that you have to put down your people came before you to be a true academic. So this professor I had was very much anti-academic, even though he was a college professor. He used to be a Baptist preacher, but he changed slightly, and he brought up the point that's the cutthroat world of academia now. Mm-hmm. It's all about power and control and prestige.
You have to put down your marker to differentiate yourself, and if you're acknowledging how you stand on the shoulders of giants, then everyone will think that you're a pygmy or something.
Yeah, exactly. And so it was really, that's actually almost a symptom of what Heidegger here was talking about, is Heidegger has become the very symptom he was criticizing.
Well, there's probably something to that. I mean, I think he's not simply, but he has some of the foibles of that, and some of the foibles of the modern age. I would also say some of the foibles of Nietzscheanism, right? He's coming out of that, right? No matter how much he's reacting to it, he's also deeply influenced by it, clearly. Okay, Dan, other.
Yeah, going back to this passage. So to me, like I also I really like this twist at the end here, and I think Heidegger, he saw himself as that madman. Like he was that guy who started crying that there is something there is a God, and no one believed him, and he was madman because he was seeing things that no one was looking there, and said there is nothing there, and he said there is something there, and I see it, and and the modern project is there is nothing there, and he said there are some traces or something, traces of traces, and And yeah, and I think it's kind of like, you know, this kind of like, it's the mother project is so total that it doesn't allow us to see something outside itself. It's kind of like that thing of, it's like it wipes the horizon, you know, there is no other horizon, it's not possible. And
So I agree with you in its own terms. That's its ambition for itself. It's Nietzsche's ambition for himself. But for me, the way in which I readily get perspective on it and understand it as a limited thing and a definite content in its own right is the past, the tradition. I see all the ways in which the modern project is different from the tradition before it, and I see its distinctiveness there. It becomes not the whole world, but a particular and finite and, you know, an epoch of being in Heidegger's terms, precisely because I can understand it as not being the whole of history, right? Heidegger has his own ways of seeing a something beyond it, and maybe he thinks that seeing it only in the traditional way is still too much stuck in metaphysics, which maybe I am, but I at least can get distance on Nietzschean metaphysics, on the will to power metaphysics, by contrasting it with Plato, by contrasting it with Avicenna, by contrasting it with the scholastics, etc., right? And I understand the modern project as a distinctive thing, that we know only what we make world as being a distinctive thing, because I know how it arose in rebellion to what came before it, right? I see the deed of founding modernity, and I see the arguments they had to make to do it, right? And it did not happen effortlessly in a vacuum. There was something there before, right? So that to me is how I get perspective and distance on it. Heidegger, yes, can help with that, but to break out of the circle of one's own time, it is enough to read widely in a deeper tradition, in my opinion, right? Do you need to also have a radicalism that can supersede everything that was heretofore? No, right? That may be where you go afterwards, but it's not necessary to get perspective on what you're living in, right? It's enough to be able to contrast it with what came before, for that liberating sense. I do agree with the value of that liberating sense, but I think you can get it from just a full appreciation of the tradition. All right, I want to talk about what we want to do next. So one of the things that we see when he's trying to claim that this sweeping understanding of the limitation of Western philosophy hitherto, he says it goes back even to the pre-Platonics. And so does it? First question, right? So the place where that has to be proven, if it is proven, is this book, Early Greek Thinking. It's a collection of essays on 4 short sayings of pre-Socratic philosophers, 1 on Anaximander, 2 from Heraclitus, and 1 from Parmenides. And it's given as four separate essays, with the order being the Anaximander, the first Heraclitus on the Logos, and then Parmenides and the second Heraclitus. So I want to do this over 2 sessions. It's about 150 pages or so. So less than that, 120 pages. So if we do 2 of the fragments in each session, we can cover it it was about 60 pages of material in each. So that would mean that we would do this on the 15th of January, and the reading would be the Anaximander fragment and the Logos fragment of Heraclitus, fragment B50 in the Dial's understanding. One thing to keep in mind here: this is going to have some passages in Greek and then translations from them given right below. The translations given right below the passages are the traditional ones, the ones that you get when it's traditional ones. The Greek fragment will be translated into German, and the English translator will have translated it from the traditional German to what we have here. But those traditional translations may not be the philosophically deepest translations, right? They'll be fine as to getting the words right and some sense of the meaning that someone saw there, but Heidegger will spend the whole essay talking about whether or not that's the right interpretation of it, right? And going through it word by word. because these are the pre-Socratics, these statements are very short. The actual amount of actual Greek is quite short. Sometimes a little bit more context than some of the Parmenides one, for example, but they tend to be a sentence or less long, right? So the amount of Greek is not all that daunting, but translation and the meaning of each of the words will be, important throughout. These are deep thinkers. I think the Anaximander fragment may be not quite as deep as the other ones philosophically. I think there might be more in it than is usually seen in it. Heidegger definitely sees things in it which give it some greater depth. I think that the Heraclitus and Parmenides fragments are much deeper, but that's my own take on these things. The Anaximander one is earlier. That's one of the reasons he brings it up, and also because it mentions his problem, time. The original way of understanding the being of beings on the horizon of time is there in the very first fragment from the pre-Socratics we've ever had. It's not a late something late found only by Heidegger himself. It's there at the very beginning. So that's where he starts. To me, this is useful for seeing, is there an understanding of aletheia and being and etc. at the earliest stage of the Greeks, which is some opening of access to transcendent, some being speaking to man, or are we already in some withdrawal of being night of metaphysics, something like that. And even here in the pre-Socratics. All of these fragments, I think, are worth wrestling with philosophically in their own right. I say the second and third, especially so. That is the Heraclitus Logos fragment and the Parmenides fragment. There are other things in Parmenides that are also definitely worth reading, but we're not going to get to them here. Unfortunately, he doesn't get to them in his book on the Parmenides either. Okay. Last, a comment or two about his own reading of it. I mean, does he see everything in them? I think there may be even more in them than he sees in them. The stuff he sees in them is probably mostly there and only partly him adding it. Let's put it that way. And he definitely sees something in common across all of them that is valuable for his thesis about the nature of metaphysics and the nature of philosophy. I think that he is finding something core to Western thought as such, that it is trying to say something about the same, about the being of beings, how the being of beings appears, something like that. That each of them is trying to say something about that. They're not trying to be physicists and just don't understand about elements yet or something like that. There's a lot of modern tendency to read the ancient philosophers as trying to be modern scientists and failing instead of understanding what they're actually trying to do. And Heidegger is notably free of that kind of mistake here. He's even freer of it than Nietzsche was. Nietzsche wrote a little book on the philosophy and the tragic age of the Greeks on the pre-Socratics. It's much shallower than this. And one of the reasons this book is valuable to me is it shows how much more Heidegger understood of this stuff than Nietzsche did. But our reason for reading it is, first of all, I want to get Heidegger's take on where the pre-Socratics, as opposed to the Socratics we've focused on before, stand in the history of metaphysics that he's overall presented. And let's assess the fairness of his claim that that being is unthought in the history of Western metaphysics, right? Okay. Anyway, that's the reason to do this. I think it'll take 2 sessions, January 15th for the first 2, and then sometime in middle or early February for the second 2. But that's the plan. Any thoughts or comments on that?
So is there any advantage to digging back into Heidegger's Parmenides book?
I wouldn't do it for this. There are some useful things in that book. Especially he basically spends a lot of time analyzing the proem to Parmenides' poem, where the goddess of truth appears, and he asks, why is there a goddess of truth in a way far from mortals at the beginning of Parmenides' philosophical poem? And he spends a lot of time on that, and he also spends a lot of time on the word aletheia itself, right? And So those things are useful in it, but disappointingly for me, he never gets to the substance, the philosophical substance of the Parmenides poem, where Parmenides explains the three ways: the way of being, the way of mortals, and the way of the altogether not. He doesn't get to that part of the poem at all. So it's a useful book in its own right, but it doesn't get to the core of Parmenides. So that part of it is disappointing to me. But
two other books on Parmenides I got questions about. Then Peter Kingsley did Parmenides in one of his early books, and then actually Joe's favorite Karl Popper has a book on Parmenides.
yes, I think Popper is interested in it primarily for the realism and rationalism sort of question. I don't know that that's going to be the most charitable reading of Parmenides, so to speak. But the other one I'm actually not familiar with, so don't know how useful it is. My own understanding of Parmenides comes both from all the places that he's discussed in the Platonic dialogues, the direct reading of all the fragments we have of him, the Parmenidean Stranger and the Doctrines of Parmenidean Stranger in Sophists and Statesmen are especially helpful for understanding at least how Plato understood the Parmenidean perspective, where it is definitely presented as, the great counterweight to the Fluxus position of Homer, Heraclitus, and the army of change, so to speak, on the side of unchanging truth. So the notion that the truth is the unchanging truth is being in the unchanging truth. That's to me the characteristic teaching of Parmenides. The Parmenides itself in Plato, obviously it's a dialogue. It's presenting, this deep dialectical investigation of the nature of being one, etc. Anyway, those interesting. If I thinking of sources on Parmenides and Parmenidean doctrine, those are the things which my own understanding has been based on the most. But some of that includes my own, reading it directly with that kind of background in mind and seeing what I can see in it. I can see, definite doctrines that are deep, some of which he goes into here, in it. One of the things he will definitely talk about here, and it is the core saying of Parmenides, is the fragment usually translated as being and thinking are the same, and the part of that which is one of the deepest statements of Western metaphysics, in my opinion. One of the things people often miss in that is, if you read the rest of Parmenides, you realize that when he says the same, he's not just putting an equal sign between them. The same is a term of art in Parmenides. He has an entire doctrine of what the same means. And specifically, in the section about the different ways, the way of mortals, which is contrasted with the divine way of being and the way of the altogether not, the way of mortals, the way of opinion, thinks that being and not being are the same and not the same. Right? So being, equating what it means to be with with something like identity, equality, sameness. That is not simply Parmenides' position on everything. It is specifically bracketed within, that is how being appears to mortals. That is how being is in opinion, right? Which is not simply how being is in itself. Anyway, so the point is, as you're reading that, when we get to reading that fragment, pay attention to the fact that the same is not a meaningless word here. It's not a simple equal sign. It is a term of art that needs definition as much as being and thinking do. So there's not one equal sign there between being and thinking. There's three. There's one between being and same, there's one between thinking and same, and there is the transitive one that is only there by implication.
Yeah, Kingsley goes into that a little bit. His book is called In the Dark Places of Wisdom.
Okay.
And he actually treats Parmenides, along with a couple others, as mystical thinkers.
Absolutely.
It has that lack of logical rigor, if you want to put it that way, or the A is not A, is missing
Yes.
from the thinking. They're in the mystical realms, and that's what Kingsley emphasized as the foundation of Western thought. So it's an interesting little different take on it. But
yeah, no, there's definitely mystical elements in Parmenides and in Heraclitus, for that matter, but especially in Parmenides. And I think Plato is also quite aware of them, although the Parmenides is often presented as a epitome of rationalism, something like that. It's designed, it's meant to be as obscure as it reads. It's not meant to be clear. All right, this is all good background. We'll see you guys. I'll put this up later tonight. It's going to be a little bit shorter than the other ones, but that's fine. See you guys on the 15th. Thank you all.